I don't need to convince anyone watching this of the importance of good documentation. I probably don't need to convince anybody about the importance of up-to-date, accurate documentation either. But keeping our docs up to date is a different matter altogether. Well, our next session promises a potential solution to this age-old developer problem. Your next talk for the 2021 CityJS conference comes from GLEB in Boston, United States of America. GLEB is a distinguished engineer at CITYJS2021, and in this talk, GLEB is arguing that test-driven documentation is the solution to your documentation woes and the perfect way to keep them always up to date. This sounds like pretty amazing stuff, GLEB. I hope you're able to deliver on that big promise. If you have any questions for GLEB about test-driven documentation or anything else related to this talk, please do join us for the Q&A session, which will be starting on GatherTown shortly after this talk. And as always, keep those comments and tweets rolling in, not forgetting the conference hashtag CityJS2021 if applicable. GLEB, it's my honor to hand the conference stage over to you.
Hi, everyone. This is GLEB BAHMUTOV from Cypress.io. Thank you for watching this talk, and thank you to CityJS organizers for inviting me and giving me this awesome red t-shirt. I really appreciate a chance to talk about JavaScript testing and documentation. An intersection of these three topics is really important in my opinion. The slides already public are now online, so you can find them at the link above. You can always tweet at me and ask me questions or argue with me on Twitter. I'm at BAHMUTOV. Before I begin, I want to quickly mention that our world is still in danger. We are heading towards a really bad future, both in our lifetimes and our children's lifetimes. So we have to act, and if we act very quickly and decisively, we can still change this. You can change your life. That's a very fast way you can control your life. You can quit your fossil fuel sponsoring bank, but most importantly, join an organization, because only by acting together, we can influence our state's action. You can find organization in your area, city, and do as little or as much as you want. So, agenda for this presentation is kind of unusual. I will talk about horses, bicycles, cars, Markdown, JavaScript, testing, and so on. So why don't we jump straight into it? This is a very common chart that is usually used to show how startups should deliver value to the customer. On the top, you see something that a startup should not do. Imagine you're trying to deliver a car to someone, right? You want to try to build, next Tesla and sell it. The bad way is to use a waterfall model where first you deliver a wheel, just a wheel. Then you connect the wheels into a platform and deliver that. As you can see, the customer is still unhappy because they cannot ride this. That's not a car, it's nothing. When you deliver wheels with a body, but still no windshield and nothing, no steering wheel, and only when you deliver in step 4 the fully finished car, then the customer sees the value. So instead, the minimum valuable product argues you should deliver something that the customer should be able to use right away. So at step 1, you deliver a skateboard. At step 2, you deliver a skateboard with some kind of wheel. At step 3, you deliver a bicycle, then motorcycle, and then the car. So at every step, your users have something that is usable. Now, this is very popular, but I still think it's incorrect, and I'll tell you why. Imagine the situation that happened 100 years ago. All you know are horses. You don't know what car is, you don't know what a motorcycle is. When people ask Henry Ford what he thinks about the customers, he says, I'm not listening to my users because if I ask them, they'll ask for a faster horse. So imagine all you know is horses. So what would you think about this kind of value delivery? Well, if someone gives you a skateboard when you're asking for a horse, they'll be confused. When you add a steering wheel to the skateboard, they'll be probably confused as well. You give them a bicycle, they'll have no idea what you're talking, probably will be angry. You give them a motorcycle, they'll just look at you like you are, a thief, and they'll be very confused by the car. I'm not saying they'll try to feed it, grass, anything, but they'll not know how to successfully use it or what infrastructure, it needs. And just to give you an example, state-of-the-art horse, right, was driving the economy, 100 years ago, right? It was a battle machine, it was agricultural machine, everything. So this is British cavalry during Waterloo. And you know how, the bicycles look during that time? Like this. So if you give someone a bicycle when they're asking for a faster horse, you're not going to be very, very successful. We can see this every time we're trying to create something new. And I'm not saying anything about other tools, but a lot of people ask us, why can't I await Cypress get and get the text of that element and then use an assertion? And we're telling them, hey, this doesn't work. That's not how Cypress is built, right? It's not better than this. This is the way you're supposed to write your test. You get inner, and then you use a fluent API saying that element that you get should have text submit. And users ask, why is this better? And we can go into retriability and so on, but we're saying, because you can do more, right? By getting element and touching assertions, you can actually rerun that command. You're not executing it once like async await requires, or promises require. Instead, you can write multiple assertions, and when they pass, you can click on the element, all declaratively described. And it looks nice when you run it because you can see how the element appears, an assertion passes, and then the color changes, and a second assertion passes, and then it clicks. So if you want to build a successful business as a startup or a small company or even a large company, you have to build a successful business at each step, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You cannot just skip steps. And you'll have different customers or different users at each step. Maybe children for the skateboard, teenagers for skateboard with wheels, happy people for bicycles, people who love loud things for motorcycles, and everyone for the cars. And at each step, you have to successfully document and describe and explain and provide warranty for everything that you provide to the customer. And for a motorcycle and for the car, you'll have to provide a lot more documentation. So if you wait for the car step to actually write good documentation, you will never deliver value because you haven't gone through that training and that iteration. There is a famous saying called John Gall's. And John Gall used to be a pediatrician, a doctor, but he said a complex system that works is found to have evolved from a simple system that worked, right? You have to have something simple that works completely, and then you can add more features. I want to change this to say a complex system that works is invariably found to have evolved from a simple, well-documented system that worked. You have to keep your eye on the prize. The big goal, you want to deliver a car, but you have to deliver the best skateboard with best user experience first. Another analogy is mountain climbing. Every time you climb up, you have to reach in and place a hook and lock yourself, like your rope, into that hook before you can climb any higher. If you don't do that, you will fall, and you'll fall much lower. And you'll have to climb all the way through the things that you already done. And I see this again and again when people do proof of concept and they don't document it, don't publish it, don't describe it. Because when they try to implement it for real, they'll actually ask themselves, wait, how did we do that? Why did we do it this way and not that way? Are there any gotchas? And they have to reinvent the proof of concept again. So there are a bunch of documentation that you can write to explain your software. There's marketing copy, guides, tutorial recipes, example applications, webinars, conference talks like this one. But one thing I don't recommend writing is comparison to other tools. And I'll tell you why. Because you are a very subjective. I will not be very, fair to the competitors of Cypress. I will try, but ultimately someone will come back and say, oh, you used old version. That's unfair anymore because I'm not expert. So I don't suggest you write comparison to our tool. I suggest your users write them. Marketing always gets some things wrong. And the big thing that marketing copy, things on your website, is they're selling the tool and not a solution to customer problems. There is a famous saying that a drill company is not selling the drills, they're selling the holes that you can drill. For example, I think Cypress gets this pretty well. We say on our website, it's a fast, easy, and reliable testing for anything that runs in the browser. We don't say, oh, it's a cross-platform E2E test runner. I mean, we say it eventually, but our marketing copy, the one that we actually explains what problem we solve, is different. The guides, the larger, kind of documentation pages that explain how to do things, often miss why I should read it, because it's an investment in time. Instead, they usually do, hey, npm install and do that, and I think we figure out in our documentation, in every guide, for example, like a guide to Cypress command line, it starts with a little blurb that says what you will learn in this particular guide. If you read it, these are the topics we'll cover, and that's why they're useful. And also, the guides usually don't state the requirements very clearly. Often they just say, open the app, right? Do something. But they should really say, we assume you know X and you've done Y and Z, right, before you start. The reference pages, like the meat and potatoes. Every command in Cypress has a reference page that's dedicated to, let's say, in this case, check command. And it follows, kind of the same structure. Often, those reference pages don't have enough examples, or examples are out of date, or examples use foo and bar. We really, really try hard to make sure all examples in Cypress documentation are using real-world scenarios, not just foo and bar, but actual buttons, headings that our users might actually see in their problems. One thing that you should definitely notice is that every anchor link should have actual URL that you can copy and send to someone, so that they don't get the link to the page, but they get linked to specific piece of information you're trying to send to them. The tutorials, larger things, how do you drill a hole, right? Explain kind of things. Often are out of date. They're missing source code, the full source code that the customer can write, run themselves. They're missing tests. They don't, they might have tests, but they don't run them on CI. And the expectations, like what this tutorial assumes, are usually not stated. And these are all common problems. I love, writing blog posts. You can find hundreds of Cypress blog posts and hundreds of other blog posts on my blog and on Cypress blog. Often I see a problem with someone else's blog, they're missing a date. If you find something from 2002, I'm sorry, that could be the best blog post, but probably it's out of date, might not be relevant. So our Cypress blogs, they include the date in the URL and also the first thing under the heading. So you know if it's still relevant, you can make a judgment call. Also, please, if you're writing a blog post, specify what version of software you're showing. In my blog post, for example, I'll say, I'm using Cypress 6.5. So, if you have Cypress 7, probably applies. But if you're using Cypress 3 or Cypress version 10 in the future, you have to double check. What I usually suggest is that when you create in your blog, if you're writing, I'm installing Cypress, show the command for installing Cypress, and then show the copy-paste that version that your software just installed in your terminal. Or even copy-paste your entire package JSON that explains all the versions of the packages that you're using. For webinars and conference talks like this one, they are a huge time investment. Preparing for this talk probably was at least 2 full days just to collect everything and put it into slides, and then practice. And the material for this conference talk came from a bunch of blog posts that also took. So the problem is not linking the slides to individual documentation pieces, right? And another problem is sometimes people don't use the conference talk of a webinar by not linking to that webinar from the rest of the documentation. And I understand why. At the end of the day, this talk will be a video and slides. You have to do extra work to make sure that content is discoverable. A good suggestion what I think, is to have every talk have its own documentation page with a video embedded and the main section described what is happening, so that a user can come in and say, oh, I'm interested in this section. Let me click and start watching from that timestamp and a link to a particular slide in a slide deck. This content, as soon as you put this on a page, is scrapable, and that means searchable, and can be linked from other pages. This particular example also includes its own Cypress test embedded right into Markdown, and I'll come back to this later. I find common obstacles to writing good documentation, the project being private. I've never seen internal wiki being up to date and fully documented. Open source, by definition, is public face, so you will document it. Also, it's unclear who is responsible for updating the docs. At Cypress, every engineer is responsible for making PR to documentation when they open PR to the code. And also hard to maintain if your documentation requires manual steps and requires you to do things in multiple places just for one change. It's hard and it won't be updated. And also, if you have common themes, if your software is fast, repeat it again and again in your documentation, not just delegate it to one place saying, we have the fastest software doing this particular thing. Repeat it so it sticks. There's one tip I want to suggest to you. If you have documentation and you have long pages, at the end, add a section called See Also or additional information that links to relevant pieces of documentation that someone might want to read. For example, if you reach the end of our reference page for Cypress check command, there probably would be benefit from reading about Cypress uncheck command and Cypress click. If you read CyContains documentation, you probably want to read CyGet and other relevant commands. And this is especially important for the guides where you have a lot of stuff, where a lot of blog posts might talk about it, specific references, conference talks, and webinars, and so on. Imagine a person who read it, invested a lot of time. You want to present them with like a prize. Here are additional things that you just unlocked, almost like a treasure hunt. Once you have a lot of docs, make sure they're scrapable and you have a good widget that explains, hey, you can find everything, right? In Cypress docs, you can find every topic because we scrape the blogs, the examples, and recipes. And I have a couple of presentations that you can look at that explain this in detail. But after you do have that, you teach your users that you can actually find things by search. For example, there was a question on Twitter. Instead of sending a link, I sent a screenshot of a search box. And I showed that the top result is actually what we're looking for. And you might say, well, this is kind of obnoxious. Why don't you send them the link? Well, I send them a reminder or a little nugget saying, hey, if you search, you'll find it. Users don't search your documentation, not because they don't want to search, but because they don't believe it has what they're looking for. If you show them once or twice that the search actually is useful, they'll avoid this whole kind of asking the question, waiting for an answer. We'll go directly and try the search first. The one thing that I mentioned is that the tests and documentations, they have to be together in order for the test and documentation to be updated together. For example, if I update this page with updated links, I don't want to accidentally destroy this page. So all these sections, they actually are tested by Cypress itself. I embed the test itself in a markdown documentation. Here's how it works. The whole purpose is to keep examples in our documentation correct and up to date as we iterate on a software. Someone asked, how do I toggle a checkbox? Instead of answering, I create a markdown in my example documentation repo where I create HTML, write them as test code, just like JavaScript HTML blocks. From this markdown file, I can run Cypress. We have a Cypress markdown preprocessor that takes the markdown file, extracts the test, and runs it, just like JavaScript spec. And remember, even the example that I've shown before, that was just markdown. Markdown is really the king, not because we can test it and run it as Cypress spec, but we can generate our documentation, and the same HTML and JavaScript become, user-facing front documentation. But now it's correct because we know we tested it. And then I reply to that question with a link to the deployed page. That's it. And of course, because this is just documentation, it's scraped automatically after deploy, and people can find that answer from now on. My personal wish or my personal advice is don't answer support questions with code example or a block or an answer. It doesn't scale. And especially for private support where you will have to do it again for another private question, always ask that question, if possible, to be asked in public forum where you can provide an answer so that everyone can see it. So instead of answering the question directly, update the documentation, create a new example, blog post, and so on, and answer with a link. That's what I've been doing recently. Always send a link. In fact, I think this is a great approach for a support team at your company. Instead of answering questions directly, they should write more examples in response to real-world use case scenarios and questions. And also, you should double their salaries. They're dealing with your users. If your support team is making your users successful, they're making the company successful. So one note about tutorials, larger examples or recipes. We think that shows not just particular snippet of code, but the whole thing, how to, for example, use Cypress to test a specific type of app. Often those tutorials, tutorials, fall behind. The dependencies stay where they were when you created, and the users see an absolute example that might not be correct anymore. And also, the users, by looking at the tutorial, don't understand what versions of Cypress or particular library or particular framework is used. So the one thing that I do on more than 100 of my repositories is to configure and update software. In this case, I use Renovate. I love Renovate. It's my go-to. I pretty much install it on everything public facing that I write. I create a Renovate JSON file. In this case, I say, hey, I want to auto merge. If tests pass, it's okay to merge this pull request with update. And also create a master issue where all the updates will be in terms of a list. And it looks like this. But this is an issue opened by Renovate. It keeps updating it. So when a new version of Cypress, in this case 4.6.0, comes out, it says, hey, you can update to that. If you click this checkbox, I'll open a PR, make sure the tests pass. And when it opens a PR, merges, it will update this comment and remove this. And you can also specify a schedule. So you can update dependencies overnight, maybe during the weekends, maybe once a month, or for different packages, create a different schedule. Maybe you want to update it as soon as it comes out. It's fine. So in this case, it opens a pull request, right? Renovate is pretty good. It actually tells you, what's the update, the release notes, and in this case, all the tests pass. So in my rules, I say auto merge is enabled. So in that case, after pull request is green, stays for, I think, for a couple of minutes or hours, I forgot, then it gets automatically merged. So this way, my dependencies are constantly bumped, so my tutorial stays relevant. And there's one more trick. You want to communicate the version of the tools that this tutorial or recipe is using. So on GitHub, I create a GitHub workflow called usually badges. And what it does, it runs only if you update package.json, right, or Readme, and also sometimes like every week. And it checks out the software, and all it does, it runs dependency version badge update, this command. And this insert or updates a badge in my Readme. In this case, This example is only interested in those two packages, so it will update those badges with whatever is currently specified in package.json. If renovate bumps it, then this workflow will run and bump those badges, and they'll be pushed back. It's really nice when GitHub workflows, if they have to push something back to the repository, the token is already set up. It's pretty much straightforward. So updating the repo itself after taking some action is extremely simple with GitHub Actions. But this communicates really clearly to anyone coming to this recipe or tutorial. Is this still relevant? What should I expect? Will it work for my version or the latest version? And sometimes, when I run all the tests, right, I can use those example repositories and those examples to actually test my pre-release of my library to make sure I'm not breaking someone who's using Next.js or Rollup or using some kind of visual testing tool. Okay. The readmes in the project and every library is extremely important to me, right? In every library that I write, for example, or in this particular Netlify plugin for Cypress, we have set up example applications in separate repos. And what we do there, we explain how to run Netlify plugin Cypress, how to set it up. And often those readmes are incomplete. So there must be a better way. But right now, the best way I found to make sure that my readme files are actually useful, that the user can use this plugin successfully, is to test it myself. So what I do when I create an example that tests how that plugin or library or Cypress itself works, I will pretty much blindly follow the readme instructions, imagining I don't know anything else. Just if it gives me a command, I will copy paste that command to install. If it gives me a snippet, I'll copy paste that snippet exactly like it says, just to make sure that the readme instructions in my software are actually meaningful and not confusing and are up to date. If you can ask someone else to do it for you, that's even better, because nothing is as simple as taking your own preconceptions and your own knowledge of a system by default and using it to do something. So GLEB, this is all great. You can test your examples and Cypress tests. What about my apps? Can I test them? Can I make sure that, for example, my walkthroughs of my applications use correct screenshots? So I have a couple of projects to deal with that. If you want to deliver documentation for your project and use Markdown, you can use Cypress Book. What this project does, as you can see in the video, you can use those embedded little snippets as tests. So for example, if you want to explain to someone how to-do application looks, you'll write a test. Hey, load the to-do app, take a screenshot, and then this screenshot will be updated automatically. You can document how application looks if the user adds a couple to-dos. So again, you write the test, and every time it runs, it updates the screenshot if it's really different. And if it's really different, the PNG file is updated, and then you can push it back to the source repository or use it to generate the documentation. It's up to you. But this kind of approach makes sure that all your screenshots in your documentation stay up to date, because they're part of a test that executes on every commit. Even better, if you go beyond static screenshots, you want to show how your software is used in action. So for you to show that, you cannot just use screenshots. You want to use an animation or a movie, because Cypress can record your test. It's only a matter of extra code to chop it up, that movie, into little segments for each test. So I have a little project called Cypress Movie. So for example, this animation was generated from the test, and Cypress Movie actually adds text overlays, pauses, and even errors in different colors. But you can use through your test to document it so that a user can see this video and understand, oh, this is how your application is working. Okay, I see. You will have all these buttons at the bottom, and they appear only after you add a couple of to-do items. So this project is still under development, but I strongly believe that tests are an excellent candidate for showing how your software is working. And from the passing end-to-end tests, we can generate the status of a project, walkthroughs, demos, project reports, so that everyone in the company and outside the company can see your software as it is working. So I want to finish with 3 points. Don't think or don't postpone documentation. You need it now. Your users are trying to use your software right now, today. And if you wait for, shoring up all your features, finalizing everything, it will be too late. You want to deliver something to keep your user base happy right now. So don't postpone documentation in favor of something else, and don't postpone it in favor of the featured day. Make sure that you pick tools and update your documentation pipeline to make sure that the documentation is correct, and updating documentation is easy. But you don't have to touch 5 different places in order to update a single example. When someone's trying to use your software, you're not there to guide them. If they have a problem, you're not there to answer their question. If they're blocked, you're not there to say, this is how you do it. But you know who is or what is there? Your documentation. That's your way of answering user questions when you're not there physically. And if you do that, and you do it well, you'll get something like this. Cypress Docs is my favorite documentation site. Thank you, Elizabeth. And thank you for listening to this talk. But slides are online. Find me on Twitter. Thank you very much.
Gleb, that was a brilliant talk. Thank you very much for delivering that as part of this year's CityJS conference. Very, very useful stuff. Who knew that tests had an extra layer of usefulness on top of just keeping our applications running properly? Not me. Hey, maybe that was just me. Please join me in giving Gleb a huge round the world round of applause. Our Q&A with Gleb will be starting any moment now over on GatherTown, so please do head on over there to post your questions to them about tests, documentation, and everything in between. If you're not on GatherTown, please do let us know what you thought of that talk on social media using the hashtag CityJS2021 or on YouTube in the comment section. He always makes me laugh when he does. He looks so serious. Gleb, thank you very much for an amazing talk. There's been so many amazing ones at this conference, but I think yours is the first time you've been talking about a topic I've never heard of before.
You've never heard about documentation or Markdown?
Test-driven documentation. It's
Yes.
a slightly different way of doing it. And we've had loads of questions come in, so I'm just going to get straight into it because we've only got about 10 minutes. So first one is from Evelyn, who is responsible for writing the docs in CyTYS, and do you have a dedicated person to keep the information up to date?
No, so every engineer is responsible for writing documentation. Literally on every pull request, checklist, the template that appears when you open pull request, there is a checkbox. If there are any changes to the user, facing aspects, provide a link to the pull request to your documentation. Our documentation lives in a separate open source repo as well. So every time you change something, you better update the docs, as well.
Is that a system you think other people should be adopting? Should that be part of our pull requests all the time?
I think so. I don't think you can throw it to someone else over the wall and say, you explain what I've done. No, it doesn't work like that. I'm all for hiring dedicated writers and editors, and they can improve your writing and they can look at the structure of documentation overall. But day-to-day, documentation writing and updating is all within capabilities of every engineer.
Okay, I like that. It is everybody's responsibility. I do like that.
Yeah.
So we have another one here. Would you recommend to save a copy of the linked resources in a webinar on the web archive? And that came from Andre.
You know, it's hard for me to say. It's up to you. My point is, make sure you're using the webinar, right, to its full potential. Webinar is a huge investment in time. You know, this talk is a huge investment in time. Are you getting out of it everything that you could? Is it linked? Can you go directly into a part where it talks about specific topic X, right? Because oftentimes we just throw webinar on YouTube and say we're done, right? And we kind of don't, kind of recycle it and say, hey, everyone's interested in this topic of code coverage, go to this webinar and this is what you will learn. So you know that, the next 30 minutes of watching it is going to be worth it.
Right? Yeah. And I think that's generally something that the developer community don't make the most of. So as a company, we work with content creators and they want to wring every last little piece of, we make a 30-minute video for them. They want 3 hours worth of content, I think.
Absolutely. So I have a blog post that kind of talks about, you want to get multiple value of everything you do, right? If you do proof of concept, write a blog post to get a value out of that. So you get like, I don't know, authority, learn something, explain. You're making a video, include examples from your documentation, link to that video from your documentation as well. Some people understand everything by reading, text. Other people understand better by watching someone code or explain it. It depends on the topic and it depends on the audience. So get the most value out of this example, out of video by cross-linking it.
Yep, completely agree. There's a huge, huge market there for people. So this question doesn't make much sense to me, but it might make sense to you. Can I derive some recommendation when PRing Dylan's crossword repo? And Dylan's crossword repo is from a talk earlier on today.
I watched a part of a Dylan's talk, right? And someone asked about crossword, right? I don't know. Send me a link, we can discuss it, right? I think everything can be tested, right? And documentation can be tested, right? So we can talk about specific use case.
Okay, so reach out on Twitter or within GatherTown.
You're right. Twitter is nice, right? Because I can see it asynchronously and answer it, right? There's a long-term kind of record. So love Twitter.
Brilliant. So Twitter it is. Pedro's been back on the Q&As today, and he's got a nice one here. What is your opinion about Cypress testing library?
It's great. People love the semantic focus of that library, find things by role. We should probably incorporate some of its command and just build it into the core, right, of Cypress. So if you use Cypress testing library, it works great with Cypress. So definitely use it and continue using it.
Perfect. So if it's working, carry on using it. I like that.
Exactly. It's
why break something that's already working?
But true.
So the last one that's been submitted so far, and it's a slightly longer one, and this is Andre again. Do you test your examples against different versions? Brackets, even older ones, as long as they are not end of life yet. And how do you handle the ever-growing testing matrix?
Right. So unfortunately, we don't test it against multiple versions, which is a shame. But it's one thing that I did not say, but it was in a list when I talk about reference, and a common mistake what people do when they write reference documentation, they forget to include a history section, right? If your command has changed, if it was added in particular version, deprecated, or changed somehow in behavior in particular version, you want to have it as a record in your history table for that command. So all our commands have that history, so you'll know if something changes. We don't test exhaustively on different versions, unfortunately. When we, for example, write Cypress, we test it against different versions of Node and different, let's say, Linux versions, right? So there's a matrix of different Node versions and Linuxes, really. But it's not like we run all our examples across different versions of Cypress. What I've been doing with my documentation and my examples, and we hope to replace the kitchen sink with my site, is that I actually, like when I test Cypress, I deploy those examples under URL that has Cypress version in it. So that if you're using Cypress 5, you can just go to Cypress examples 5.0.0 and see all examples that ran against that. And we can always rerun it against that version, right? So as we release new versions of Cypress, we just keep adding new URLs, but not override the old ones. So you still see examples as they were at that particular moment.
That's a smart way to handle it.
Many libraries do that. Same with Lodash, you go to Lodash and you get Lodash and then URL 417, for example, right? So it's common practice.
Yeah, doesn't mean it's not smart though.
That's true.
So somebody's already tried to reach out to you on Twitter about the previous question, and they said your DMs are not open. So I assume they should just tweet at you, and then
exactly. Yes. So, and I'll tell you, right? Like DMs, if we follow each other, right? And at some point, I was just swamped with DMs, and I decided, okay. And again, when I spoke about what you get from support questions, and I said, don't do it in private, don't answer the question. People reach to me through all different communication channels, and my response usually, you have a question about testing or Cypress, open GitHub discussion, ask in chat, I will answer immediately. I'll go there and I'll answer it, but there so that everyone can see it. That's why, like, it's in private, it just doesn't scale.
No, it doesn't. And that goes back to what you said about taking value from everything you do. That answer is valuable to somebody, and that is why Stack Overflow exists, for example.
Right. I have a big problem. Like, I don't do Stack Overflow because it belongs to someone else. Everything I do there, right, it gives value to Stack Overflow.
Yeah.
So, and I don't control, for example, even the scraping. In my examples, I scrape the way I write documentation, all the headers, and I even scrape the comments in JavaScript because oftentimes they provide, the actual thing that people are looking for. I don't control the scraping on Stack Overflow. So even if we provide answers there, they're not discoverable. Or at least they're not as discoverable as when we do it ourselves in our controlled, site. So that's why.
And this isn't a question so much as a statement. I think that the developer community, generally speaking, are moving back to controlling their own content to some extent. I've seen a lot of people restart blogs after not posting in 2 years, which is really
you want to control it. I mean, it's your effort, right? And what does it bring you ultimately? It's imperfect because they have to satisfy the wide variety of questions, right? So like you cannot control like scraping, for example, and ultimately you make money for someone else rather than building your brand. And so I probably discover more by going to the project's GitHub repo or website than using Stack Overflow.
Perfect. And we're fast approaching the end of our Q&A session, but I do have some rapid fire questions to wrap us up.
I'll try to answer.
Tabs or spaces?
Spaces.
Good man. Good man.
Of course, free spaces, right?
I go with 5 myself, but
and 2 spaces, yeah.
2 spaces. Good. JavaScript or TypeScript?
JavaScript. I do a lot of hacking where if you like TypeScript would never I have a platypus code. Like it should not work, but it does work. So TypeScript would never allow it.
Perfect. And finally, and this is a fresh one just for you, Node or Dino?
Node so far.
Cool. Have you had to play with Dino in like 2 words?
No, just looked at the ideas, right? Looked at the presentation, and we'll see where it goes. Right now, just Node. I have my hands full.
Fair enough. Gleb, it has been an absolute pleasure to chat with you. Thank you for an amazing talk. I'm sure everybody took a hell of a lot away from it. And thank you for joining us this year at CityJS 2021.
My pleasure. Thank you for the t-shirt.
Ah.
Appreciate it.